New Year's Eve, 1994. Russian generals promised Grozny would fall in 2 hours. Instead, over 1,000 soldiers died in the first 48 hours. Columns were trapped, commanders were killed, and the world's second-largest army was humiliated on live television. What went so catastrophically wrong that this invasion became Russia's worst military disaster since World War II? The answers begin with the invincible army rolling into the city, utterly certain of victory. Russian commanders approached Grozny with the confidence of a superpower. In Moscow, Defense Minister Pavel Grachev stood before cameras and declared, "One airborne regiment can take Grozny in 2 hours." The world's second-largest army had just finished a decade in Afghanistan, and it still believed in the old Soviet strategy. Massive columns of armor, overwhelming firepower, victory by sheer numbers. The plan was drawn straight from the textbooks. 3 armored spearheads would strike the city at once, converging from the north, west, and east. Supporting them were 38,000 troops, 230 tanks, 454 infantry fighting vehicles, and nearly 400 armored personnel carriers. Russian intelligence counted only about 2,000 Chechen fighters inside Grozny, most with little formal training. The math seemed simple, a 19-to-1 advantage, backed by airstrikes that began on December 11, 1994, flattening the presidential palace and shattering the city's skyline. Officers expected a quick advance and a victory parade by New Year's Day. Maps handed out to battalion commanders showed entire districts in a single inch, and they missed the maze of alleys and courtyards that defined Grozny's heart. Urban warfare was not in the manual. The orders were clear: drive forward, seize the center, and end the war before the world woke up to the new year. Inside the command posts, confidence masked a series of quiet failures. Battalion commanders unfolded their maps to find vast swaths of Grozny reduced to a blur. 1 centimeter on the page covered entire neighborhoods, alleys vanished, and crucial intersections appeared as nameless lines. The maps, scaled at 1 to 100,000, were meant for highways and open fields, not a city where every block hid a potential ambush. Not a single Russian unit had rehearsed urban combat. Training manuals still pictured tank battles across plains, not firefights amid apartment blocks. There had been no exercises for moving through dense city streets, no drills for house-to-house searches, and no lessons on fighting in stairwells or basements. Reconnaissance teams never entered Grozny before the assault. No patrols mapped the maze of side streets, and no intelligence officers catalogued strong points or escape routes. The Army's logistics records showed supply trucks packed for a fast advance, not a siege. Radio frequencies overlapped, but no one had planned for the chaos of a city's concrete canyons. Officers trusted that overwhelming numbers would compensate for every gap. Yet these blind spots, unseen on the parade ground, would soon leave entire brigades lost, isolated, and exposed, searching for landmarks that did not exist on their own maps. Shamil Basayev's fighters moved with a purpose born from experience. Nearly 500 strong, his so-called National Guard was no ragtag militia. Many had fought in Abkhazia, learning the value of speed, deception, and local knowledge. In Grozny, they split into small groups, wolf packs of 20 or 30, each one trained to strike and melt away before Russian firepower could pin them down. Basayev's men mapped every sewer tunnel and basement, using them to shift positions unseen, surfacing behind Russian lines or vanishing when the shooting started. The defenders knew that numbers alone would not save them. Instead, they turned to a strategy built on mobility and misdirection. Chechen units moved along pre-planned routes, always in contact by radio, each group ready to reinforce another or ambush a lost Russian column. Radio spotters, sometimes using civilian frequencies, tracked Russian movements and relayed updates to RPG teams waiting in hidden positions. The city's civilians played a role too. Some volunteered as guides, approaching Russian officers with offers to lead them safely through the maze. In reality, these guides were part of the trap, steering armored columns down narrow streets toward intersections already marked for destruction. Basayev's core fighters rarely stayed in one place for long. They struck from rooftops, basements, and upper floors, then slipped away through back alleys or underground passages. Each unit carried just enough ammunition for a single engagement, relying on speed and surprise rather than brute force. The Chechens never tried to hold ground against the Russian advance. Instead, they let the enemy come to them, drawing columns deeper into the city's heart, where every window and doorway could hide a gun. Russian soldiers, unfamiliar with the terrain and misled by their own maps, found themselves surrounded by enemies they could not see. The stage was set for disaster. New Year's Eve in Grozny became a study in disaster. The 131st Maikop Motor Rifle Brigade, over 1,000 strong with 26 tanks at its core, moved into the city from the northwest. At first, the columns advanced in perfect formation, tanks and armored vehicles spaced just as they had been on parade grounds. Local men approached, offering to guide them through the maze of ruined streets. Trusting these strangers, Russian officers allowed their columns to be led toward Minutka Square, unaware that every intersection, every window, every rooftop along the route had already been mapped by Chechen fighters. As the columns entered the square, the guides vanished. Within moments, rocket-propelled grenades struck the first and last vehicles, sealing the convoy inside a 400-meter kill zone. Chechen fighters, positioned on rooftops and in basements, unleashed a coordinated assault. Rocket-propelled grenade teams worked in rhythm, one shooter, two loaders, a spotter whispering targets over a radio. In less than an hour, burning tanks blocked every escape. Soldiers trapped inside their vehicles faced fire from above and below. Those who tried to run were cut down by machine gun or sniper fire. The brigade's command structure collapsed as officers fell, radio antennas targeted, insignia making them easy marks. Calls for support went unanswered. Smoke, confusion, and panic filled the air. By the end of the day, the Maikop Brigade had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the more than 1,000 men who entered Grozny that morning, only 13 staggered out on foot days later. 26 tanks had entered the city. Almost all were left as twisted wrecks. The 81st Motor Rifle Regiment, advancing on a parallel route, met a similar fate, its battalion destroyed in a separate ambush. On January 7th, General Viktor Vorobyov, attempting to regain control of the chaos, was killed in the street. The first Russian general lost in battle since World War II. The cost of the assault was measured not just in ruined machines, but in the sudden erasure of entire units. Russian armored columns rolled into Grozny with confidence built on decades of open field doctrine. But the city's dense streets exposed every flaw in their equipment and planning. The T-72 and T-80 tanks, workhorses of the Soviet era, were designed for battles across plains. Their main guns could only depress about 10 degrees, leaving them unable to target fighters on rooftops or in upper floors. The tank's top armor, less than 40 millimeters thick, offered little protection against rocket-propelled grenades fired from above. Chechen RPG teams aimed for the turret ring, the seam where the turret meets the hull, exploiting this weak point with devastating effect. Post-battle inspections found that nearly 70% of tank kills came from top-down hits, crew hatches blown open, turrets sheared off by direct strikes. The formation of the assault columns made matters worse. Vehicles advanced 5 to 6 meters apart, a spacing meant for parade grounds, not urban combat. In Grozny's narrow avenues, this left tanks and infantry fighting vehicles trapped nose to tail, unable to maneuver or support each other. Infantry, ordered to ride inside their vehicles, hesitated to dismount for fear of snipers. This separation allowed Chechen fighters to isolate and destroy the armor piecemeal, while Russian infantry remained bottled up, unable to clear buildings or defend the columns. Attempts to coordinate by radio quickly broke down. Chechen fighters targeted antennas and officer insignia, knowing that killing commanders would plunge the columns into confusion. In the chaos, Russian units sometimes fired on each other, unable to distinguish friend from foe amid the smoke and debris. The sum of these failures, technical, tactical, and organizational, turned overwhelming force into a liability and left Grozny's streets littered with the wreckage of modern armor. The Battle for Grozny was not just a contest of armies and tactics, it became a tragedy measured in civilian lives and the fate of a generation sent to fight. In 5 weeks, the city lost nearly 27,000 people, 6% of its entire population. Most were killed not in crossfire, but by relentless artillery and airstrikes, and by the collapse of basic services. Apartment blocks became tombs as families huddled in basements, hoping the next rocket would land elsewhere. Hospitals overflowed, running on candlelight, with doctors performing surgery on kitchen tables. Streets once filled with children and market stalls turned to fields of rubble and silence. Among the Russian soldiers sent into Grozny, youth was the only constant. The average conscript was 19 years old, barely out of school, with just 6 months of training. Many had never fired their weapons outside of drills. Letters found in abandoned packs spoke of confusion, hunger, and fear. Boys who had never left their home villages were suddenly thrust into a city at war. Some units broke into apartments, searching for food as supply lines faltered. Others wandered lost, separated from their commanders, relying on rumors and fragments of radio chatter. Chechen defenders, fighting for their homes, recognized the faces of neighbors among the fallen. For them, every block carried memories. For Russian conscripts, every street was foreign, every window a threat. The cost of each advance was counted not just in destroyed vehicles, but in the lives of the young and the innocent. The silence in Moscow did not last. As news of the disaster in Grozny leaked out, the official story began to unravel. Families across Russia waited for word from sons and brothers who had vanished into the city. Instead of casualty lists, they received telegrams stamped "missing in action." The Ministry of Defense insisted the operation was proceeding as planned, but the streets outside its gates told a different story. Mothers of conscripts gathered in growing numbers, demanding answers that no officer could provide. Soon, they forced their way into the ministry itself, clutching photographs, letters, and dog tags, evidence of lives lost and denied. Smuggled videotapes shot by Chechen fighters and foreign correspondents slipped through the border and aired abroad. The footage showed burning convoys, columns of destroyed armor, and Russian prisoners, images that contradicted every official statement. What had been described as a swift victory now looked like chaos and defeat. General Lev Roklin, sent to the front as a troubleshooter, refused the Hero of Russia medal offered for his role. He declared, "I saw nothing glorious in fighting a war on my own land." His words echoed through the ranks and into the homes of grieving families. The gap between the Kremlin's proclamations and the reality on the ground widened with every new report. Inside Russia, trust in the military and government began to erode, replaced by anger and disbelief. The truth could no longer be contained behind closed doors. Orders from Moscow shifted overnight. Russian commanders, reeling from the carnage of the first week, abandoned hopes of taking Grozny block by block. Instead, they unleashed the arsenal in an operation meant to be complete and decisive. For 24 hours, the city shook under a barrage of rocket artillery and bombs. BM-21 Grad launchers fired hundreds of salvos, each salvo sending 40 unguided rockets rippling across residential blocks. The sky filled with the thunder of Su-24 bombers dropping high explosive payloads. Thermobaric weapons, fuel-air explosives, detonated in apartment courtyards, sucking the oxygen from shelters and igniting firestorms that raced through basements and stairwells. Artillery commanders worked in shifts, calculating grid coordinates by the minute, targeting entire city sectors rather than enemy positions. Civilian neighborhoods became reference points for destruction. The aim was not precision, but saturation. If a building might shelter a fighter, it was erased. Shells landed at a rate of thousands per hour, collapsing hospitals, schools, and markets. Grozny's old stone facades crumbled under relentless impact, leaving only skeletal frames and smoking piles of debris. By dawn, Grozny's skyline had vanished, replaced by a landscape of ruins. The assault did not distinguish between defender and bystander. In the eyes of the artillery, every block was hostile. This was no longer a battle for control. It was a campaign to wipe Grozny from the map. In the aftermath of Grozny, Russian military planners faced a reckoning. The operation had begun with a force of 38,000 and ended with the loss of nearly 225 tanks and armored vehicles in a single week. Burned-out hulks lined the streets, a visible measure of doctrine gone wrong. Analysts pored over after-action reports, counting not just the destroyed machines, but the breakdowns in command, communication, and training. Manuals that once described city fighting as a simple extension of open battle were quietly rewritten. The lessons of Grozny, overwhelming firepower, systematic destruction, and the need to clear civilians before an assault, were distilled into a new approach. While never formally named in Russian doctrine, these principles became known among strategists worldwide as the Grozny template. The consequences extended far beyond Chechnya. Russian officers who survived the urban inferno would later teach that firepower, not maneuver, ruled the city. The cost was clear. Columns should never again advance without first leveling resistance from a distance. These ideas found their way into military publications and training exercises, shaping how armies would approach city battles for decades. What happened in Grozny became required reading in war colleges, not just in Russia, but in the United States and Europe. The ruined city stood as a warning: ignore the realities of urban warfare, and the price will be paid in steel and blood. Urban warfare now defines modern conflict, from Mariupol to Mosul. The lesson endures. Technological might cannot guarantee victory in cities built for people, not tanks. When the price of taking ground is measured in ruins, no side truly claims a win. The unresolved challenge remains. Can future wars spare the cities that hold the memories and lives of millions? Share your thoughts in the comments below.